Close your eyes now. Allow the weight of the day to fall away from your shoulders, sinking deep into the surface beneath you. Imagine that you are standing on a high cliff, overlooking a sea that stretches forever toward the horizon. This is the Ionian Sea. The water is a deep, shimmering indigo, the color the ancient poet Homer once called wine dark. The sun is beginning to set, casting long, golden fingers across the ripples of the water. There is no rush here. There is no noise, save for the rhythmic, steady pulse of the waves against the ancient limestone rocks below. You are standing in the lands of antiquity. Below you, the same tides have turned for thousands of years, carrying the wooden hulls of heroes, kings, wanderers, and monsters. Tonight, we leave behind the frantic pace of the modern world. We pull up a chair beside a dying fire and we let the steady, ancient pull of those tides carry us away. Tonight, we journey into the heart of Homer's Odyssey, one of the oldest and most enduring stories known to humanity. On its surface, it is the tale of a man trying to find his way back to his family after a long war. But beneath that surface it becomes something deeper and quieter, a meditation on survival, patience, memory, longing, and the strange beauty of home. Sing to me of the man Muse, the man of twists and turns, driven time and again off course, once he had plundered the hallowed heights of Troy. For 10 long years, the bronze-clad warriors of Greece fought beneath the towering, sun-bleached walls of Troy. It was an age of myth, of heavy shields, flashing spears, and gods who walked among mortals, casting long shadows across the dusty plains. But wars, no matter how grand, must eventually end. Troy fell, reduced to ash, embers, and memory, and the surviving kings turned their ships back toward the west. Most returned quickly, their linen sails catching favorable winds. But for one man, the journey home would become a second war, a 10-year struggle against the sea, against the monstrous forces of nature, and against the wounded pride of the gods themselves. His name was Odysseus, king of Ithaca. Odysseus was not like the other Greek kings. He was not the tallest, nor the strongest, but he possessed a mind like a labyrinth. He was a master of metis, an ancient Greek word meaning cunning, resourcefulness, and sharp intelligence. It was his mind that had devised the wooden horse that finally breached the gates of Troy. As the fires of the ruined city burned down to grey ash, Odysseus looked out across the Aegean Sea. 12 ships sat in the harbour under his command. These were long, sleek, wooden vessels, painted with dark pine tar to protect them from the salt, each pulled by rows of weary oarsmen. His men carried the spoils of war, gold, fine fabrics, and bronze armour. But more than anything, they carried a deep, aching desire to see the rocky shores of Ithaca again. They longed to hold their wives, to sit beside their own hearths, and to watch their children grow. The sails were hoisted. The heavy linen cloth caught the northern breeze, snapping tight in the wind. The oars dipped rhythmically into the water, churning the deep blue sea into trailing foam. At first, the voyage seemed almost ordinary. They sailed northwest, landing on the coast of Thrace to raid the Cicones, who had been allies of Troy. Odysseus, always thinking ahead, urged his men to take their spoils and leave quickly before the inland tribes could gather. But his men, flushed with victory and heavy with wine, refused to listen. They feasted on the beach, slaughtering sheep and drinking late into the night. It was their first mistake. At dawn, the Cicones returned in force from the interior hills. By the time the Greeks cut their ships loose and fled back to the safety of the waves, many companions had been lost on the shore behind them. As the 12 ships pulled away from the blood-stained coast, a dark shadow fell over the water. Zeus, king of the gods, unleashed a monstrous north wind. The storm tore at the sails. The sky turned the colour of bruised iron, and the waves rose like mountains, threatening to swallow the black ships whole. For 9 days the men could do nothing but grip the wooden hulls and surrender themselves to the mercy of the sea. They were blown past their home, past Cape Malea, driven far out into the unknown waters of the deep south. On the 10th day, the wind died as suddenly as it had begun. The sea became smooth, almost like glass, reflecting the pale blue of a strange sky. Ahead, a low island rose from the shimmering horizon. The ships glided into a quiet, sheltered harbour. The water was warm and clear, lapping gently against powdery white sand. There were no harsh cliffs here, no roaring winds, only a deep, heavy silence, broken by the sigh of a soft breeze through the trees. The men dragged themselves ashore, exhausted from days of fighting the storm. They built small fires on the beach and boiled fresh water. Odysseus, cautious in unfamiliar lands, selected 3 trusted men and sent them inland to discover what kind of people lived there. The scouts followed a path lined with lush, fragrant greenery. Soon they encountered the inhabitants of the island. They were not warriors, they were not monsters, they were a gentle, peaceful people known simply as the Lotus Eaters. These people bore no malice. They welcomed the Greek scouts with soft smiles and offered them a gift, the sweet, honeyed fruit of the lotus flower. The scouts accepted it. They bit into the pale blossoms and tasted the nectar. And in that moment, everything changed. The lotus fruit did not harm the body. It did something stranger. It softened the mind. It wiped away pain, worry, and memory. The heavy images of the 10-year war at Troy faded. The faces of wives waiting on the cliffs of Ithaca, the longing for children, the ache for home, all of it drifted away like mist over water. The scouts sat down in the warm grass. They no longer wished to return to the ships. They no longer wished to carry messages. They wanted only to stay beneath the lotus trees, chewing the sweet fruit, free from memory and time. Back on the beach, Odysseus waited. The sun dipped low, painting the sky amber and violet, but the scouts did not return. Sensing danger, he led a small party inland. When he found his men, he was horrified. They stared softly into the distance, smiling faintly, indifferent to his arrival. They begged to be left behind, asking only to remain in that beautiful, eternal twilight. But Odysseus knew that a life without memory was no life at all. To forget home was to lose oneself. He did not argue with them. Instead, he dragged them back down the path to the ships, where the rest of the crew watched in confusion. He bound them safely beneath the rowing benches and called out to the others, "All hands aboard! Clear the beach! If any of you taste that honeyed plant, you will lose your hope of home forever." The men, frightened by the strange calm of their companions, scrambled into place. The anchors were lifted. The oars struck the grey sea. The ships surged forward, leaving the tranquil island behind, and slipping once more into the vast, unpredictable waters of the unknown. They had survived the temptation of rest, but ahead of them, waiting in the mist, was a danger of a different kind. The ships soon approached a fertile, wild land. This was the country of the Cyclops, a race of solitary, one-eyed giants. Homer tells us they lived without laws or assemblies, without cities, courts, or shared customs. They did not plough the land or plant crops by hand. The earth simply gave them wild wheat, barley, and heavy clusters of grapes, nourished by the rains of Zeus. Each giant lived alone in deep caves high on the mountains, ruling his own household and caring nothing for his neighbours. They knew nothing of ships, trade, or the crossing of seas. Across from the Cyclops mainland lay a small uninhabited island, thick with woods and filled with wild goats. No hunters entered its thickets, no shepherds brought their flocks to graze. It remained untouched, a peaceful sanctuary of grass, trees, and soft breezes. Odysseus and his fleet entered the island's natural harbour in the dead of night. Fog rolled over the water, and the moon hid behind heavy clouds. Yet the ships slipped safely through the rocks, as if guided by an unseen hand. The men lowered the sails, crawled onto the sand, and fell into deep sleep beside the gentle tide. When dawn appeared, fresh and rosy-fingered, the men woke to a bright morning. Wild goats moved through the trees, and the hungry crew hunted with bows and bronze spears. It was a bountiful day. All day long, until the sun sank below the horizon, they feasted on roasted meat and drank the sweet red wine they had taken from the Cicones. As evening settled, they looked across the narrow water towards the mainland. They saw smoke rising from the giants' fires. They heard, faintly, the deep voices of the Cyclops and the bleating of their sheep. Curiosity, that dangerous spark in the mind of Odysseus, began to burn. The next morning he called his crew together. He would take one ship and discover whether these people were savage and lawless, or whether they honoured the gods and welcomed strangers. Odysseus rowed across the strait with his men. Near the shore they found a massive cave half hidden by laurel trees. Outside it stood a rough courtyard built of heavy stones, tall pines, and ancient oaks. This was the home of Polyphemus, a monstrous shepherd and son of Poseidon, god of the sea. Odysseus chose 12 brave men to accompany him. In his hand he carried a goatskin flask filled with a special wine given to him by Maron, a priest of Apollo. It was dark, sweet, and extraordinarily strong, the kind of wine normally mixed with many measures of water before drinking. They entered the cave while the giant was away in the pastures. Inside they found baskets overflowing with cheeses, pens filled with lambs and kids, and rows of vessels holding rich white milk and whey. The men begged Odysseus to take the food, drive the animals to the ship, and sail away. It was wise advice. It was the safe choice. But Odysseus refused. He wanted to see the giant for himself. He wanted to know whether this creature would offer him a guest gift, as required by Xenia, the sacred Greek law of hospitality. So they waited. As evening lengthened, a thunderous sound rolled down the mountain path. The ground seemed to tremble. Polyphemus had returned. The giant entered the cave carrying an enormous bundle of firewood. He dropped it to the stone floor with a crash, and the Greeks fled into the shadows. He drove his ewes inside to milk them, then lifted a boulder so vast that no group of ordinary men could have moved it. He set it in the mouth of the cave, sealing them all inside. The light of the world vanished. Polyphemus milked his sheep, made cheese, and built a fire. Flames flickered against the dark walls, and in that sudden orange glow, his single eye caught sight of the Greeks. "Foreigners," he boomed, "who are you? From where do you sail? Are you merchants or pirates roaming the sea?" The Greeks trembled, but Odysseus stepped forward. He told the giant they were Achaeans returning from Troy, blown off course by the winds of Zeus. He asked for hospitality and reminded him that Zeus protected guests and travellers. Polyphemus laughed coldly. "You are a fool, stranger, if you tell me to fear the gods. We Cyclops care nothing for Zeus or the immortals. I will spare you only if my own heart tells me to do so." Then the giant leaned closer and asked where their ship was moored. Odysseus saw the trap at once. He lied smoothly, saying that Poseidon had wrecked their ship on the rocks and that only these few men had survived. The giant gave no answer of pity. Instead, he seized two of the men and ended their lives. The others could only shrink back in terror as Polyphemus finished his terrible supper, stretched himself among his sheep, and fell into a heavy sleep. The cave grew cold. The fire sank into embers. Odysseus sat awake in the darkness, his mind turning over plan after plan. His first instinct was to strike the giant while he slept, but then his sharper mind stopped him. If Polyphemus died, no one would be able to move the great stone from the entrance. The Greeks would be trapped forever in the cave. So Odysseus mastered his anger. He waited for dawn. When morning came, Polyphemus woke, rekindled the fire, milked his sheep, and took two more men. Then he rolled away the massive stone, drove his flocks into the sunlight, and sealed the cave again behind him. Odysseus searched the gloom for an answer. At last he saw it, a massive staff of green olive wood lying near the sheep pens. To the Greeks it looked as large as the mast of a ship. Odysseus cut off a long section, sharpened it to a point, hardened it in the fire, and hid it beneath the dung on the cave floor. Evening came. The giant returned. This time he drove all his animals inside, leaving none in the courtyard. He sealed the cave once more, milked his sheep, and took two more men. Then Odysseus stepped from the shadows, holding a bowl filled with the dark wine of Maron. "Here, Cyclops," he said softly, "drink some wine now that you have eaten. Taste what our ship carried. I brought it as an offering, hoping you would pity me and help me home." Polyphemus drank deeply. Pleasure spread across his face. "Give me more," he said, "and tell me your name, so I may give you a guest gift." Odysseus poured again, and again. The powerful wine clouded the giant's mind and slowed his limbs. Then Odysseus said, "My name is Nobody. My mother, my father, and all my companions call me Nobody." The giant rumbled with drunken laughter. "Then this is my gift. I will eat Nobody last." With that, Polyphemus collapsed into sleep. Odysseus and his men moved quickly. They heated the sharpened olive stake in the fire until its point glowed red, then drove it into the giant's single eye. Polyphemus screamed so loudly that the surrounding cliffs seemed to shake. The neighboring Cyclops came running to the cave, calling through the stone. "What is wrong, Polyphemus? Is someone harming you?" From inside, the giant cried, "Nobody is harming me. Nobody is attacking me." The others paused. If nobody was harming him, then perhaps his suffering came from the gods. They told him to pray to Poseidon and return to their caves. In the darkness, Odysseus allowed himself a silent smile. His trick had worked, but the danger was not over. Blind and furious, Polyphemus rolled away the boulder and sat in the cave mouth, stretching out his hands to catch anyone trying to escape. Odysseus studied the sheep and formed one final plan. He tied the animals together in groups of 3, fastening one man beneath the middle sheep of each group. For himself, he chose the largest ram, curled his hands deep into its thick fleece, and waited beneath it for dawn. When morning came, the animals moved toward the pasture. Polyphemus felt along their backs as they passed, but never thought to check beneath them. When the great ram, carrying Odysseus, reached the doorway, the giant paused and stroked its wool. "My favourite ram," he murmured, "why are you last today? Are you grieving for your master?" Then he let it pass. Once outside, Odysseus dropped from the fleece, freed his men, and hurried them down the rocky path toward the ship. They drove the sheep before them, loaded the animals aboard, and pushed away from shore. But as the ship reached shouting distance, Odysseus's pride overcame him. "Cyclops," he called, "if anyone asks who defeated you, tell them it was Odysseus, son of Laertes, who lives in Ithaca." Polyphemus roared in rage. He broke off a great piece of rock and hurled it into the sea. It crashed near the ship, throwing up a wave that nearly drove them back to shore. The men rowed with all their strength. Then Polyphemus lifted his hands to the sky and prayed to his father, Poseidon. "Hear me, dark-haired shaker of the earth. If I am truly your son, grant that Odysseus may never reach home. But if he is destined to see Ithaca again, let him return late, in a foreign ship, having lost all his companions, and let sorrow wait for him there." Poseidon heard the prayer. From that moment onward, the wine-dark sea became a labyrinth of hardship for the king of Ithaca. The ship sailed on until they reached Aeolia, the floating island of Aeolus, keeper of the winds. It was unlike any land in the mortal world. A wall of unbroken bronze surrounded it, gleaming in the sun, rising above sheer cliffs that seemed to drift across the sea. Inside those shining walls, Aeolus lived in peace with his wife and 12 children. His halls were filled with music, feasting, and laughter, untouched by the griefs of ordinary men. Aeolus welcomed Odysseus kindly. For a full month, he hosted the travellers and asked about Troy, the Greek kings, and their long wandering. Odysseus told him everything. When at last Odysseus asked to return home, Aeolus offered a marvellous gift. He took an ox-hide bag and bound inside it all the wild winds of the world, the stormy north, the fierce south, and the restless east. He tied the bag shut with a silver cord so that not even the smallest breath could escape. Then he released only the gentle west wind, Zephyr, to carry the Greeks safely toward Ithaca. For 9 days and nights the voyage was perfect. The men scarcely needed their oars. The west wind filled the sails, and the ships moved beneath the stars. Odysseus refused to sleep. He stood at the helm, guarding the course himself. On the 10th day, the misty hills of Ithaca rose from the sea. The air smelled of thyme, sage, and wood smoke. They were so close they could see shepherds on the cliffs and fires burning in the villages. Home was just across the bay. And then, at the very edge of success, exhaustion overcame him. Odysseus sank onto the deck and fell into a deep sleep. His men looked at the ox-hide bag tied with silver cord. Whispers moved among them. They imagined gold, silver, and secret treasure. Jealousy clouded their judgment. While Odysseus slept, they untied the cord. There was no treasure inside. The trapped winds burst free with a roar. The sea exploded into chaos. The ships were seized and driven away from Ithaca, back across the waves, while home disappeared behind rain and spray. When Odysseus woke and saw what had happened, despair settled over him. For a moment, all hope seemed to leave him, but he endured. He wrapped himself in his cloak, lay silent on the wet deck, and let the storm carry them where it would. The winds drove them all the way back to Aeolia. Odysseus returned to the bronze palace and begged Aeolus for help, but this time the keeper of the winds refused. "Leave this island," Aeolus said. "Your return proves that the gods are against you." So Odysseus went back to his men. There would be no divine wind now. They took up their oars and rowed onward, exhausted and broken in spirit. For 6 days and nights they rowed deeper into the lonely corners of the map until they reached the land of the Lestrygonians, a race of enormous, merciless giants. Their harbour seemed safe at first. 2 sheer cliffs curved around a still basin of water, leaving only a narrow entrance to the sea. Inside, the water was calm as glass. 11 of the Greek ships entered and tied themselves along the stone walls, but Odysseus, cautious by nature, kept his own ship outside, moored near open water. He sent 3 men inland to scout. They met a young giantess at a spring, who directed them to the palace of her father, King Antiphates. But when they entered, they discovered too late that these people honoured no law of hospitality. 1 scout was seized, and the other 2 fled back toward the harbour. Then the Lestrygonians came rushing from the hills. From the cliffs above, they hurled massive stones down onto the trapped ships. Timber shattered. The harbour became a place of panic and destruction. 11 ships were lost. Odysseus saw the disaster from outside the harbour. He drew his sword, cut the mooring cables, and shouted for his men to row. His lone ship surged into the open sea, escaping just in time. Behind them, the rest of the fleet was gone. With heavy hearts, the surviving crew sailed onward. They had escaped death, but they mourned their lost companions. At last, the single black ship reached Aiaia, a lonely, forested island rising like a green jewel from the sea. This was the home of Circe, a powerful goddess with braided hair, a mortal voice, and deep knowledge of magic. Odysseus guided the ship into a hidden sandy cove. The men collapsed on the beach, overwhelmed by grief and exhaustion. For 2 days and nights they lay there in silence, listening to the tide. On the 3rd morning, Odysseus climbed a rocky hill with his bronze spear. Through the dense canopy of oak trees, he saw a plume of smoke rising from the centre of the island. Somewhere in the forest stood a palace of polished stone. Remembering the Cyclops and the Laestrygonians, Odysseus did not rush forward. He returned to the shore and divided his remaining crew into 2 groups. 1 group would be led by Eurylochus, his trusted lieutenant. The other would remain with him. They cast lots, and the lot fell to Eurylochus. So Eurylochus led 22 men into the woods. Deep in the forest they found the palace of Circe. It stood in a wide clearing, beautiful and strange. Around it moved wolves and mountain lions, but the animals did not attack. Instead, they approached gently, wagging their tails and fawning like tame dogs. Circe's magic had softened them, leaving them calm and unnatural. From inside the palace came a sweet voice singing. Circe moved before her loom, weaving cloth so fine and radiant it could only be the work of a goddess. The men stood at the gates, enchanted by the sound. One of them called out. The singing stopped. The doors opened, and Circe appeared, smiling warmly. She invited them inside. Relieved, The men followed her into the hall. Only Eurylochus stayed behind, suspicious and afraid. Circe seated the men on polished chairs and prepared a feast of honey, cheese, barley, and strong wine. But into the food she stirred a secret potion, one meant to make them forget their homeland and their desire to return. The hungry men ate. When they had finished, Circe lifted her wand and touched them. In an instant their bodies changed into swine, though their minds remained human within. They understood what had happened, but they could no longer speak. Circe drove them into her pens and scattered acorns and berries before them. Outside the palace, Eurylochus waited in the shadows. When the men did not return, he fled back through the dark woods toward the ship, carrying with him the heavy knowledge that another strange danger had found them on their long road home. Eurylochus ran through the forest with all the speed his exhausted legs could muster. Branches whipped against his tunic, dry leaves crackled beneath his sandals. Behind him, the strange palace of Circe slowly disappeared among the trees, hidden once more beneath the green canopy of Aeaea. Yet even as he fled, part of his mind struggled to comprehend what he had witnessed. The forest itself seemed unnaturally still. The wolves that had approached him had not behaved like wolves. Their eyes had been bright and intelligent, almost human. Their movements had possessed a curious gentleness. There had been no hunger in them, no wild instinct, no fear. To a Greek sailor this was perhaps more unsettling than outright violence. For thousands of years men had understood wolves. They were dangerous, certainly, but they were part of the natural order of the world. What Eurylochus had seen inside the woods of Aeaea belonged to something else entirely. It belonged to the realm where gods and mortals crossed paths, where ordinary rules no longer applied. As he hurried down the narrow woodland path, shafts of golden afternoon sunlight filtered through the leaves overhead. Dust motes drifted lazily through the warm air. The island seemed peaceful. And yet, beneath that peacefulness, there was something ancient, something watchful. The Greeks often imagined islands such as these as places where the mortal world grew thin. The sea itself encouraged such beliefs. Imagine sailing across the Bronze Age Mediterranean. For days, perhaps weeks, all one could see was water. Then, suddenly, an island would appear upon the horizon. Sometimes it would be inhabited by friendly fishermen, sometimes by rival kings, sometimes by nobody at all. And sometimes, according to the stories of the ancient world, by beings who were neither fully mortal nor fully divine. The Mediterranean is scattered with thousands of islands. Even today many remain rugged, isolated, and mysterious. To the sailors of Odysseus's age, each distant shoreline represented uncertainty. Fresh water, food, shelter, or death. The sea offered no guarantees. As Eurylochus continued toward the beach, the afternoon slowly drifted toward evening. The sun hung low above the western horizon. The air carried the scent of pine resin, wild herbs, and distant salt water. Somewhere overhead, unseen birds called softly from the treetops. For a moment, despite everything that had happened, the island seemed beautiful. Perhaps that was the most dangerous thing about it. The most dangerous places in the Odyssey rarely announce themselves through terror alone. The Lotus Eaters had welcomed strangers peacefully. Circe had welcomed them with smiles and music. The sirens whom Odysseus would someday encounter would sing beautiful songs. Again and again, the journey teaches the same lesson. Not every threat appears as a monster. Sometimes danger arrives disguised as comfort. Sometimes it appears as hospitality. Sometimes it speaks with a gentle voice and offers a warm meal beside a fire. By the time Eurylochus emerged from the woods and saw the black ship resting upon the shore, the shadows had begun to lengthen across the sand. The remaining sailors immediately rose to meet him. At first, they saw only one man. Then they realized what that meant. The others were gone. The conversations around the campfire stopped. The waves rolled softly against the beach. Far out upon the water, the sea reflected the fading colors of the sky. For several moments, nobody spoke. Eurylochus stood breathing heavily. His face was pale, his hands trembled. And when at last he began to tell the story, the listeners felt a familiar chill settle over them. Once again, another island had taken their friends. Once again, the road home had grown longer. And somewhere beyond the trees, hidden among the deep forests of Aiaia, smoke continued to rise from Circe's palace, curling upward into the evening sky as calmly as if nothing at all had happened. The sailors gathered around Eurylochus as dusk settled over the shoreline. A small fire crackled near the center of the camp. Sparks drifted upward into the deepening blue of the evening sky. Beyond the narrow beach, gentle waves rolled endlessly toward the sand, retreating and returning with a rhythm so steady it seemed older than memory itself. For a long while, Eurylochus struggled to find the words. How could he explain what he had seen? How could he describe companions transformed into creatures that rooted through the earth with snouts and hooves, while still retaining the minds and memories of men? The Greeks listened in silence. They had endured storms sent by Zeus. They had escaped the cave of Polyphemus. They had watched entire fleets vanish beneath the stones of giant cannibals. And yet something about Circe unsettled them in a different way. Monsters could be fought, storms could be endured, but magic belonged to a realm beyond ordinary understanding. The ancient Greeks believed the world was filled with hidden forces. Every river possessed a spirit. Every mountain had its guardian. Every grove of trees might conceal a nymph. The boundary between the natural and supernatural was never entirely clear. To walk through a forest such as the one covering Aiaia was to enter a place where the ordinary rules of life seemed less certain. The men stared toward the dark line of trees rising beyond the beach. From here, the forest appeared peaceful. The branches swayed gently in the evening breeze. Moonlight had begun to gather along the upper leaves. Nothing about it suggested danger. Nothing about it suggested enchantment. Yet somewhere within those woods stood a goddess who could transform sailors into beasts with the touch of a wand. As the last light of day faded, Odysseus sat quietly apart from the others. His expression revealed little. Those who knew him best understood this habit. Whenever danger appeared, Odysseus grew quieter. His mind retreated inward. While other men panicked, he calculated. While others imagined disaster, he searched for solutions. He listened carefully as Eurylochus recounted every detail: the palace, the singing, the feast, the potion, the transformation. Not once did Odysseus interrupt. When the story finally ended, silence returned. Only the sound of the sea remained. A cool breeze drifted across the beach. Above them, stars slowly emerged one by one. The sailors recognized many of them. For years, those stars had guided their travels across the Mediterranean. There was Orion rising above the eastern horizon. There was the Great Bear circling endlessly around the northern sky. And there was bright Arcturus shining steadily above the dark waters. To ancient sailors the stars were companions. Kingdoms could fall, ships could sink, friends could be lost, but the constellations remained unchanged, night after night, year after year, generation after generation. Somewhere far away on the rocky island of Ithaca, Penelope would be seeing those same stars. Telemachus would be seeing them too. Odysseus could not know it, but his son was no longer a child. The boy he had left behind before sailing to Troy had grown into a young man. Years had passed. Seasons had come and gone. Olive trees had been planted and harvested. Children had become adults. Entire lives had unfolded while Odysseus wandered across the sea. Perhaps that thought weighed most heavily upon him. Not the monsters and not the storms, not even the wrath of Poseidon. Time itself had become his enemy. Every day spent wandering was another day stolen from home. The fire burned lower. One by one the sailors stretched out upon the sand. Some wrapped themselves in cloaks. Others rested beneath overturned sections of sailcloth. Soon the beach grew quiet. Only Odysseus remained awake. He sat facing the sea. The moon had climbed higher now. Its pale reflection stretched across the water like a road of silver. Beyond that shimmering path lay countless miles of darkness. Somewhere beyond that darkness was Ithaca, a small island and a simple kingdom, not wealthy, not powerful, yet more precious to him than any palace in the world. The longer he wandered, the more beautiful home became within his memory. Perhaps that is one of the quiet truths hidden within the Odyssey. Home is rarely appreciated when it surrounds us. We become accustomed to familiar walls, familiar roads, familiar faces. Only when we are separated from them do we begin to understand their value. For Odysseus, every hardship sharpened that understanding. Every storm, every loss, every distant shore, all of it deepened his longing for the rocky hills of Ithaca. The night continued its slow passage. The stars wheeled overhead. The tide rose and fell. And somewhere deep within the forest, hidden beyond the trees, Circe sat within her palace. Perhaps she worked at her loom beneath flickering lamplight. Perhaps she sang softly to herself as she wove. Perhaps the transformed sailors huddled together in their pens, frightened and confused, wondering whether they would ever see their human forms again. No one on the beach could know. Yet by dawn Odysseus had already made his decision. He would go. He would enter the forest alone. He would find the palace, and he would confront the goddess herself. Not because he believed he could overpower her, not because he thought himself immune to magic, but because leadership demanded it. Again and again throughout his journey, Odysseus had faced impossible choices. A king could not abandon his people. A captain could not abandon his crew. The men who had entered Circe's hall had trusted him, and now they were trapped. If there was even the smallest chance of saving them, he would take it. As the first pale hints of dawn began to appear above the eastern horizon, Odysseus rose from the sand. The sea glowed faintly with silver light. The forest remained dark and silent. Birdsong had not yet begun. The world seemed suspended between night and morning. Carefully he gathered his weapons. His bronze sword hung at his side. His spear rested comfortably in his hand. The familiar weight of both brought reassurance. Steel and bronze made sense. Magic did not, yet they were all he possessed. The sleeping sailors slowly stirred as the first rays of sunlight touched the shoreline. Some watched quietly as Odysseus prepared to depart. Others offered prayers to Athena. A few simply sat in silence, unwilling to voice their fears. They had already lost too many friends. Nobody wished to imagine losing their king as well. The forest stood before him like a wall of green shadows, ancient, silent, waiting. Odysseus took a deep breath. Then, without hesitation, he stepped beyond the edge of the beach and disappeared beneath the trees. The sunlight faded almost immediately beneath the dense canopy. The air grew cooler. The sounds of the sea diminished behind him. Ahead lay winding paths, hidden clearings, and mysteries older than any kingdom. Somewhere within that vast woodland, fate was preparing an encounter that would change the course of his journey. For before Odysseus could reach the palace of Circe, another immortal had already begun making his way toward him through the quiet forest. A god, a messenger, and a bearer of unexpected hope. The forest seemed to swallow Odysseus whole. Within only a few moments of leaving the beach, the sounds of his companions had vanished completely. The gentle murmur of the sea faded behind him, until it became little more than a memory. In its place came a different kind of silence, the silence of an ancient woodland untouched by human hands. Towering oaks stretched toward the sky, their branches intertwined high overhead, forming a canopy through which only scattered shafts of sunlight could pass. The beams fell like golden columns between the trunks, illuminating drifting clouds of dust and tiny insects dancing lazily in the morning air. The ground beneath Odysseus's sandals was soft, with centuries of fallen leaves. Each step released the earthy scent of moss, bark, and damp soil. Here and there, small streams wound through the undergrowth, their clear waters slipping over smooth stones polished by countless years of flow. Ferns unfurled beside their banks. Wildflowers bloomed in patches of sunlight. Birds called softly from unseen branches above. To a traveller arriving from the sea, it would have seemed like a place of perfect peace. And perhaps that was why so many dangers in the Odyssey arrived cloaked in beauty. Odysseus walked steadily forward. He did not rush, his eyes remained alert. Experience had taught him that haste often invited disaster. The Cyclops had taught him caution. The Lotus Eaters had taught him the danger of forgetting. The Bag of Winds had taught him the fragility of success, and the Lestrygonians had taught him how quickly safety could become catastrophe. Each trial left its mark upon him. Each loss added another layer of wisdom. As he moved deeper into the woods, the light gradually brightened. The trees began to thin. The forest opened into a broad clearing washed in warm sunlight, and there, standing quietly beside the path, was a young man. And so, for now, we leave Odysseus beneath the ancient trees of Aiaia. The forest around him remains quiet. Above, the leaves sway gently in the morning breeze. Somewhere ahead, hidden among the sunlit clearings and winding woodland paths, the palace of Circe waits patiently. The faint sound of her singing still drifts through the trees, carried upon the air like a distant dream. But that is a story for another night. For now, let the image slowly fade. Picture the island growing smaller and smaller, as though viewed from the deck of a ship drifting peacefully out to sea. The forests soften into green shadows. The palace disappears beneath the canopy. The smoke from its hearth rises quietly into the blue sky before dissolving into the horizon. The sea returns, the endless, wine-dark sea. The same sea that carried merchants, explorers, kings, and dreamers across the ancient world. The same sea that reflected the stars long before the first cities rose from the earth. The same sea whose waves continue to wash against distant shores even now. Allow your thoughts to drift with those gentle tides. There is nowhere to travel, nothing to accomplish, no storms to survive, no monsters to outwit, no journey left to complete tonight. Simply rest. And as the waves roll endlessly beneath the stars, imagine Odysseus continuing onward through the quiet forest, carrying with him the hope of saving his companions and finding the road that will one day lead home. Thank you for joining me on this part of the journey. May your sleep be peaceful, may your dreams be calm, and may the ancient stories carry you gently into the night. Good night.